Yeah, good day, everyone. You are welcome to this presentation. This presentation focuses on the concept of philosophy of education. I am Maruf Akinwale Oladejo from the Department of Educational Management, University of Lagos, Lagos, Nigeria. What are the lecture objectives that we intend to attain by the end of this presentation? I believe that by the end of this lecture, you should be able to have acquired 80% proficiency to explain the concept of philosophy of education, to discuss the relevance and importance of philosophy of education, and of course, to be able to describe the relationship between philosophy of education. In our previous video or presentation, we have discussed the two concepts of philosophy and education separately. In this presentation, we have married these two concepts together to become philosophy of education. And that is the major focus of this presentation. And the stated lecture objectives are in line with what we hope to attain by the end of the presentation. Now, let's go. By way of introduction, I begin by saying that the fundamental principle of philosophy is to realize that all truths comes from reality, and this reality must be reflected in education. Don't forget that we have discussed the branches of philosophy, and one of these branches is metaphysics, which deals with the study of reality. Therefore, it is the fundamental principle of philosophy that all truth comes from reality, and this truth must be reflected in education. It therefore presupposes that philosophy of education is a guide to educational practice. It involves examining fundamental questions about what education is, why it matters, and how it should be conducted. Now, philosophy of education or philosophy on its own deals with the beliefs, values, and principles that guide educational practices and policies. It is therefore a rich and diverse field that encompasses a wide range of ideas, theories, perspectives on the nature and purpose of education. How do I mean? Philosophy as a concept is uh, very rich and diverse to the extent that it covers a wide range of theories, perspectives, and ideas, basically on the nature and purpose of education. Don't forget that we are talking here about philosophy of education. Now, how has philosophy of education been defined, by, by scholars? I will not stress much, of our time. I won't stress us much. I will make reference to some definitions. There are as many definitions as we have experts, in the field. And as I always encourage my students, I want a situation whereby they will be able, to define any concept given to them using their own sentences, using their own words. And that is why I stated at the beginning of this presentation that I believe you should have acquired 80% proficiency to be able to define the concept of philosophy of education. I want to go as far back as 1965 when Frank Kena described philosophy of education as a systematic study of the philosophical processes and problems in connection with what? With education. Because we are talking, about the concept of philosophy of education. Going forward, Blaker 2000 described philosophy of education as the critical examination of basic issues affecting education and the development of a coherent and comprehensive view of the subject matter. What is that subject matter? Education. And don't forget that I said philosophy is, a very rich and wide field. And that is why Blaker described philosophy of education as critical examination of basic issues affecting education and the development of coherent and comprehensive view of the subject matter. Philosophy of education is a field of applied philosophy that draws from established branches of philosophy in epistemology, ethics, axiology, and politics, you know, to raise and address questions of educational aims, methods, and problems, and of course, of educational policy, pedagogy, and curriculum. You could see that a lot of areas, has been highlighted, talking about questions of educational aims, methods, problems, as well as of educational policy, pedagogy, and curriculum. This one is just still underscoring the fact that, philosophy of education tries to take a comprehensive, a broader view of education. Uh, Kwazayo, Koswayo, 2017, described philosophy of education as the philosophical interrogation of the values, beliefs, and practices that shape what? That shape education, with a focus on promoting human flourishing, social justice, and cultural integrity. And Obaji, 2018, opined that what we call philosophy of education is nothing but a systematic reflection on the nature, purpose, and principles of education that are conducive to the holistic development and liberation of the person. This is according to Obaji 2018. Now, we can as well, define this concept as a framework for thinking critically, a framework for thinking critically about the purpose, methods of education, ultimately guiding educators in their practice and shaping the educational experiences of learners. What I want to bring out from here is that philosophy is an applied, field of knowledge, applied field of study, such that the moment we apply philosophical concepts, philosophical theories, you know, to the practice and nature, problems, policies of education, we are, dealing with philosophy of education. We have philosophy of religion, philosophy of science. This underscores that, the fact that philosophy is an applied, discipline. It can be applied to other disciplines to be able to bring the philosophical basis of this discipline. Now, why is philosophy of education important? Especially in teacher education program. Why do we have to include this course in any teacher education program? One, understanding educational theories and principles. Understanding educational theories and principles. Philosophy of education explores different approaches to teaching and learning, helping educators to understand the underlying theories and principles that guide educational practices. It is when we applied philosophical, knowledge to education that we will be able to, understand previous theories on education that different philosophers, have propounded, such that they will be able to guide our educational practices. Philosophy of education, like I said, tries to explore various approaches. There are different approaches to teaching, different approaches to learning, which will help we as educators, you know, to understand the underlying theories and principles that guide educational practices. Okay. Secondly, informing teaching methodologies. Philosophy of education assists in informing teaching methodologies. Educators can reflect on their teaching practices, develop more informed and effective teaching methodologies based on a deep understanding of educational philosophy. When we have a deep understanding of philosophy that underlies or theories or principles that underlie educational practices, then we will be in a better position to be able to reflect on our teaching practices. How am I faring? Am I adopting appropriate teaching method? And because there are different teaching methodologies, I strongly believe that you will come across, if you have not come across, different kinds of teaching methodologies. And of course, we have traditional, we have modern teaching methodologies. So when we have uh, uh, knowledge of philosophy of education, we will be able to reflect on our teaching practices. Are we doing it well? Are we using appropriate method to pass our message across? This can be achieved when we have knowledge of philosophy of education. The third importance is shaping educational policies. And of course, I have just you know highlighted some of the definitions that have been given forward by some scholars before I wrap it up with my own definition. And I did mention that philosophy of education, you know, focuses on different policies, pedagogies in education. And therefore, it helps to shape educational policies. Education policies and practices are influenced by philosophical perspectives on the purpose, goals of, and goals of education. Most of the policies and practices we have in education, they have they have underlying philosophical perspectives. They have underlying philosophical perspectives. And of course, in my subsequent presentation, we'll talk about uh, the philosophy of Nigerian education. This is just to tell us that our practices in education, our policies in education, they are influenced by philosophical perspectives on the objective and the purpose and goals of education. As time goes on, in the subsequent presentation, we'll talk about the goals of Nigerian education. We'll talk about the goals of each level of education. But what we are just saying here is to emphasize the importance of philosophy of education. Therefore, studying this course, this philosophy of education, will help educators and policymakers to make well-informed decisions about educational policies and practices because they have philosophical perspectives, and philosophy demands from us to have critical thinking about issues. So when we have critical thinking about issues, we'll be able to make well-informed decisions about such issues. The next importance is promoting critical thinking and reflection. I just spoke about it now. Philosophy of education is very, very important in the promotion of critical thinking and reflection. You know, especially about education. So, philosophy of education encourages critical thinking, inquiry, and reflection, which are what? Which are essential skills for both educators and students. They, they, the critical thinking skills, inquiry skill of reflection, they are very, very critical, for us as educators and for our students as well. And the only way we can develop these skills is to embark or engage in philosophical inquiries because it promotes critical thinking and reflection, in us. The next importance of philosophy of education is improving communication and collaboration. Improving communication and collaboration. You begin to wonder how does philosophy of education important in this regard? It is important because educators communicate and collaborate with colleagues, collaborate with students, collaborate with parents. In fact, collaborate with every stakeholders in the education industry. By doing what? By developing a shared understanding of the underlying principles and goals of education. When you engage, when educators of philosophers of education, engage or collaborate with colleagues, with students, with parents, with every other stakeholders, especially in, on issues that have to do with the principles and goals of education, you will have to communicate and you'll be able to develop shared understanding because we will have thought critically, about what we want to be discussing or engage other stakeholders on. So it improves communication and collaboration on the parts of those that engage in philosophy of education. Now, in what areas are philosophy and education related? Because if two concepts are not related, we cannot apply one on the other. And I've said that philosophy is an applied discipline. In this course, we are applying it to, education. But there must be relationship between these two concepts before we can say that we let us apply one, to the other. So, in essence, what are those areas in which philosophy and education, cross each other? Foundational principles. Foundational principles. Now, basis for educational theories, practices, and goals. There are some foundational principles, that form the basis for educational theories, practices, and goals. And philosophical inquiries into the fundamental questions about knowledge, ethics, reality, and the human condition shape educational philosophies, guiding educators in defining the purpose, methods, and content of education. What am I saying? What I'm saying here is that education has its own foundational principles. Philosophy has its own foundational principles. And these principles, especially uh, philosophical principles, also form the basis for educational theories, for educational practices, and educational goals. In other words, all the educational theories, practices, and goals, they derive from the foundational principles that philosophy brings on board. So, in this regard, philosophy and education, they interwoven when it comes to foundational principles. Foundational principles of education are derived from philosophical inquiries. Secondly, ethical framework. Ethical framework. How do philosophy and education, relate or intersect when it comes to ethical framework? Now, ethical theories and principles like utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics that have been explored in philosophy provides an ethical framework for educational decision making, pedagogical practices, and interactions within the educational community. How do I mean? There are some ethical principles, there are some ethical, theories that are found, that have been explored extensively in the field of philosophy. There's philosophical, there's ethical theories and principles in philosophy now provide that ethical framework in which we can take educational decision making. We have effective pedagogical practices and interactions within educational community. So all the kinds of interactions we are having within the school system, all those kinds of pedagogical practices are derived from ethical theories and principles that are found in philosophy. So when it comes to ethical framework, philosophy and education, they intersect because it is those it is from those ethical theories and principles that have been explored extensively in philosophy that you know come together to create that framework for virtually everything we do in the field of education. What about educational values? Philosophy and education also relate when it comes to the issue of educational values. Philosophical debates on the ideal aims of education, usually guide educators in shaping educational environments that align with such values as promoting critical thinking and fostering creativity. We've discussed that a branch of philosophy has to do with the study of values, okay? And all the debates that we have in the field of education, philosophy, that focus on the ideal aims. What are the ideal aims of education? What education is supposed to actually, attain? If we have ideal aims of education, we'll be properly guided to shape educational environment, to determine what goes on in education industry, in school system, that we align with the values of promoting critical thinking and fostering creativity. So what we are saying here is that if we want to shape education in such a way that we will have the values that would promote critical thinking in us, that will foster creativity in us, we need to come up, we need to have, gotten an ideal aim of education. And for us to have ideal aims of education, we must engage in philosophical, inquiries, because it is from philosophical debates that we can have an idea about the ideal aims of education that will help us to promote those values that we have talked about. Going forward, philosophy and education are related when it comes to epistemological inquiry. How do I mean? Epistemology is a branch of philosophy that deals with the study of knowledge. We have discussed this in our previous presentation. Now, educational philosophies draw on epistemological debates to shape methodologies, assessment practices, and goals that are related to knowledge acquisition and critical thinking. When we discussed previously, I said that epistemology is a branch of philosophy that deals with the study of knowledge. And knowledge acquisition is one of the reasons we, you know, uh, engage in educational practices. We want to acquire knowledge, and the knowledge that we want to acquire is a branch of philosophy. Are they not related in that regard? They are related because educational practices or philosophies they draw on epistemological debate, the debate that shape the methodologies, that shape the assessment practices, that shapes goals that are related to knowledge acquisition and critical thinking. So when it comes to epistemological inquiry, philosophy and education, they are related because philosophy has a branch that deals with knowledge. And it is this knowledge acquisition that education also focuses on. So they are related. What about analytical tools? How are philosophy and education, related in this regard? They are related in this regard because philosophy equips educators with critical thinking skills. I've been saying this, logical reasoning, and argumentation techniques that are what? That are very, very essential, that are very, very critical for effective teaching, for curriculum design, and educational research. You want to, you know, uh, be effective in teaching. You want to design curriculum. You want to engage in educational research, and you are not critical, about thinking. It may be very, very difficult. It may be very, very difficult. And for us to develop, to have, to be effective in teaching, to be effective in designing curriculum, to be effective in conducting educational research, we need analytical tools. And these tools can be gotten from philosophical inquiry because philosophy equips in us that critical thinking skills, that logical reasoning, that argumentation techniques. And all this, critical thinking skills, logical reasoning, argumentation techniques, they are important, for things that we do in education, effective teaching, curriculum design, and of course, educational research. They are very necessary when it comes to any of these things, okay? What about curriculum development? Curriculum development as one of the areas, where philosophy and education are related. Educational curricula often reflect philosophical commitments to specific values, beliefs, and goals, shaping what is taught, how it is taught, and why it is deemed important for students to learn. How do I mean? When we are talking about curriculum development, The educational curriculum that we develop usually reflect our philosophical commitments to certain things, our philosophical commitment to values, to goals, to beliefs, and all this help, in shaping what is taught. When we know the values we want students to acquire, when we want to talk about the beliefs, when we want to talk about educational goals, you know, we need to engage in a philosophy. It is when we have this philosophical commitment that we'll be able to shape what is to be taught to our students. How are we going to teach the students? And why do we think that what we want to teach the students is important for them to learn? So it is therefore uh, presupposes that education and philosophy they are related, because for us to be able to shape what we want to teach, for us to be able to determine how we want to teach, for us to be able to say, okay, what we want to teach these students is important for them to actually learn. We need to reflect on our philosophical commitment. What are those specific values? When we determine the values, when we determine the goals, when we determine the belief, we will bring all this into consideration. Anytime we want to talk about curriculum development, talk about what we want to teach, how we want to teach them, and so on, students, and so on and so forth. Thank you for your rapt attention. So far, so good. In this presentation, I have been able to uh, talk on philosophy of education. The definitions that have been put forward by various scholars, few of them were brought to the fore. Then we talk about importance of philosophy of education. We examined those areas, those points that serve as the reasons or the rationale for including this course, in any teacher education program. And finally, we examined some areas where philosophy and education are related. Thank you once again for your rapt attention. We'll see again in the next video.